My name is Ara, and I'm the host of the Tamil Creator Podcast. I chat with creators from all over the world to share their stories and discuss hot topics in a way that I hope inspires, educates, and entertains you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tamil Creator. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about sex. And we have an awesome guest on the pod today. Her name is Mathusha Senthil. Her day job is an associate educator for digital marketing at BrainStation. And by night, or maybe the rest of her time, she is the founder of Thaen Pot and Thaen X, which is both a sex toy company as well as a media platform that helps South Asian women feel more comfortable with their sexuality. So let's jump into it. So Mathusha, why don't you tell people a bit more about yourself, your family, your upbringing, and kind of how that helped played a part in kind of your, eventually starting Thaen Pot and Thaen X.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's very exciting to be amongst all the really cool people that you've had so far. My upbringing, well, I was born and raised in Toronto, which I guess kind of plays into having started this platform, but I'm a born and raised Torontonian. I identify as Tamil Canadian. Grew up in Scarborough, where most Tamil people tend to have grown up back in the 90s. Traditional Tamil upbringing, right? Grew up in a fairly conservative family, at least early on, before we had the type of exposure we do today to other people around us. So I grew up in a pretty conservative family. I wouldn't say it was quite unconventional by any means, not like I grew up talking about sex or anything like that with my family. It was still pretty hush-hush. Ultimately, went to university, did some communications marketing stuff, started working in the startup space, created a podcast of my own a few years ago called Dash the Cuddy, which led to other incredible conversations with other Tamil women. And so one day, through all of those different pathways, I guess, Thaen Pot and Thaen X was born. So yeah, in a quick little summary of my upbringing.
Cool. So I guess, how did you come up with the name, and how did you actually finance the beginning of both these initiatives, and maybe talk about how they make money as well?
Mm-hmm. So the name was actually really complicated. It was a few months of kind of going back and forth with a few friends who were really great supports for this entire endeavor. Only because, one, we wanted to somehow still keep some Tamil roots within it, right? We didn't want to give it a purely English name. We still wanted it to be identifiable or traced back to my Tamil heritage. And then the other half of it was choosing a name that wasn't hard to pronounce, because it's still mainstream and we are predominantly targeting the diaspora. So we wanted something that would kind of roll off the tongue, but would still be identifiable. So Thaen Pot, which I think is was pretty cliche, I guess, right? Because Thaen in Tamil means honey, and then pot. So it's almost like a sexual innuendo a little bit, if I'm being honest. And the name just stuck. We threw it out one day in a WhatsApp group, and I was like, I like the sound of it. So Thaen Pot was what we decided to call the shop. And then Thaen X, I decided would be the publication or the platform name, just because X is also associated with sexually explicit stuff, although we kind of use that as a sarcastic, this is Thaen X. So that's how the name came about. And then in terms of how the idea came up, on my podcast, my previous podcast, we did an episode on sex. And for me, it was a casual conversation. I think I'm grateful that I have a group of friends that are quite open when it comes to this stuff. So we did a podcast on it, and then I realized that this is not the norm, right? A lot of people don't have the same experiences in terms of having the same support system, even within their friends, of being able to talk about these things. And it wasn't just older people, it was also young people, teenagers, also women who are married, who were really engaged. And so I thought that there was a need for a platform. So the platform was the initial idea. It was a space for people to be able to share their stories, experiences, but also almost like an educational tool, which I think was missing, especially catered towards the South Asian Tamil experience. So the platform was the initial goal. And then I also realized that sex toys were also very like unconventional for a lot of people, even amongst my friends who have never been into a toy store, or they've never purchased one for themselves. And I remember the first toy I even bought my friend was for her like 19th birthday, and it was just so normal to me. But again, it was that realizing other people don't have the same experiences, and maybe a little bit more shy or conservative in their approach to these things. So then the shop came around as a space for people to be able to peruse, explore without being overwhelmed. So a lot of the online stores or even in-person stores today, there's just a lot to consume, right? Like you don't really know where you're looking, what you're looking for. And it's also hypersexualized in a way that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Like you would not open that website in front of your friends or your parents, right? So we wanted to create a space that was sensual, still prioritized brown bodies, but like was a safer space to be on. And if you were caught open with a tab, no one's gonna look at it and be like, you're watching porn. So it was kind of removing the hypersexualization of how people perceived this industry, as well as creating a platform for people to share their stories, experiences, and learn from it. So they just both fit together. And then I was looking for a way of paying our writers, because I know, especially around these topics, it takes a lot for them to share, right? We're still pretty conservative. As much as I love to say that we are progressing as a community, there is still quite a bit of conservatism within that, right? And that's okay. But I wanted to be able to pay people for their labor, especially because we were asking them to share their stories with us, or their education or their learnings. So the shop itself actually funds our writers, and so all the content on our website, as well as our editor-in-chief. And so, yeah, so all the funds that are coming directly from our shop. So if anyone were to support our shop, that would directly fund the platform, and vice versa. In terms of how I initially started it, it was self-funded. I think I'm very privileged to be in a position where I don't have any other external responsibilities like a house or kids or anything like that. So I was able to self-fund it in the beginning, but now almost 1 year into it, it is being pretty much funded by the people who are visiting our website.
That's awesome. As you're talking about kind of toys and like kind of how, you know, you wouldn't go to a site to find, like buy sex toys, like even though it's a bit more open and talked about these days. I know that there's kind of a huge surge in like sex tech, like in terms of both men and women, especially male sex toys, for whatever reason. But even then, there's like, even though there's money to be made, it's a business. There's like nothing really crazy about it. I just remember reading all these VCs that were very hesitant to kind of put any money into sex tech, and there's like a few kind of VCs that are trying to specialize in it. But it's kind of interesting that you bring that up. For both of these, I guess Thaen Pot and Thaen X, why was it so important for you? Like I know you said that you have this group of friends, you can have very open discussions, and like you were saying, like thinking back, growing up as well, I think it was a very, whenever sex was talked about, especially with like South Asians, especially South Asian men, it was almost like in a very immature way. Like we didn't really know how to talk about it. It was, yeah, it was just kind of very immature, the discussions. So you're right, like what you have is very, with your friends is very special. So I guess is the idea for you to kind of, by having this platform, enable these discussions in a more normal way instead of kind of being hidden away? Like why was it so important for you to create it?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue here, or how people perceived it, was shame, right? Like that is a word that comes to mind when you think of anything to do with healthy sexual conversations, right? Whether it's about your health or whether it's about pleasure, like all these things are still rooted in shame, I think, as a community, and not just the Tamil community. This is like the broader ethnic community, I want to say, but I thought it was really important to start dismantling that shame by talking about it. That's the only way that you can normalize these conversations. And so the key here is to start by normalizing them by speaking about these things. And so by publicly sharing your experiences or talking about it or writing about it, but then also providing a safe space where people don't feel dirty, right? Quote, dirty coming into the space. I think that is our goal, right, is to provide a space for people to feel safe, people to kind of unlearn that shame that they may have grown up with or thought to perceive this as being, and then encourage them to not, they don't have to participate, but also to just look at it from a different perspective, right? We sell sex toys, but our sex toys are not just for simply pleasure, right? They help people who struggle with PCOS. They help people who had just given birth, right? They help people who are asexual. So it's beyond just a pleasure-based thing, right? It's not a dirty word. And so therefore we're trying to normalize how people perceive this as a whole.
Got it. This episode is sponsored by nobody. That's right, nobody. So if you could be kind enough to hit that subscribe button, that would mean a lot to me. So like, I guess, do you see what you're doing with Thaen Pot and Thaen X as just kind of the beginning of this platform, or like this, yeah, I guess this platform you're trying to build to talk, talk about this message? Like, what are some future plans, whatever you want to share, in terms of kind of the evolution of this?
Yeah, I mean, this question comes up a lot. Some people have asked, oh, well, what if other people start doing this now? And I think that's a great thing, especially being in my particular space, is that it would be amazing to have more South Asian Tamil people doing things that are pertaining to sex and wellness, right? So I personally encourage it. I would love to see more of it. And everyone loves a competition, right? So by all means, go for it. But in terms of future plans, I really hope to kind of increase the volume of content that we push out there, as well as expand the content. So currently we do editorials and just written pieces in general, but I really would like to expand to poetry, video content. These are all things people have approached us about, but we just have not had the capacity during this time to do it. But ideally, sometime next year, we would like to grow it out to be more multimedia, as opposed to just articles.
I feel like another opportunity, and again, you might have heard this or thought of it, is I just think of community, because you talked about the podcast and this kind of being sparked from that discussion. I feel like there's probably a lot more people than you even know that want to talk about this, and maybe a safe space, not just online, but in person, which is obviously different than online. So I'm curious, have you thought of that as well, or?
Yeah, no, that would be cool. Like I love the idea of getting together with a group of people, and being able to talk about these things, even doing just like in-person events. But then unfortunately during the time we launched, we launched in the middle of COVID, so it feels almost foreign in sense of like, what can we do in person? But as things slowly start kind of going back to normal, yeah, I would love to explore what we can do, right? Like we have had people who reached out to us as far as India, saying things like, how can we, work with you? And if, to your point, if that looks like building community or just providing them with spaces to come together and share, I think that in itself would build some amazing solidarity, as well as dismantle any type of shame that they carry.
What are a couple of messages or like feedback you've got from people that read your content or like buy your products, etc., like in terms of how it's impacted their life?
Yeah, well, we get all types of messages from, I'm 40 something years old and this is the first sex toy I've ever bought, right? Or we get messages from mothers who say, like, for instance, one had said she has 2 children and she's never experienced an orgasm, which to me is like wild, right? But it's such a lived reality for so many people. But then we also get like 17-year-olds who say, this really opened their eyes because they didn't know that other people went through X, Y, and Z. So it's about making people feel, quote, normal, whatever that looks like to them, without feeling like they're other or they're different in a bad way. So we've gotten some really great feedback from people of all ages. I think going into this, I was anticipating more of like the millennial crowd to be the target audience, just because that's what predominantly the podcast listener age was. But it kind of took off in its own way. Like we don't do any paid marketing. There's a lot of marketing regulations when it comes to like doing paid marketing for adult content. So a lot of it is just solely based off word of mouth and people sharing. And we've seen some incredible growth in terms of our audiences from India to Australia to Canada and the US. And beyond even like the Ulam and Sri Lankan Tamil community, right? Like we're seeing all sorts of Tamils from all over the world. So the feedback has been incredible. And I think if anything, it has opened my own eyes in terms of like how big this actually is.
We talked a lot about the positive of the impact that, you know, your platforms have created, but I'm sure there's a lot of negative or like, you know, haters. It's natural, but especially around this topic, which,
Oh yeah.
yeah. So like, what kind of stuff have you heard or like, yeah.
Yeah, I think there is this like misconception for a few men, I'm not going to say all men, but for a few men that for whatever reason feel like we're infringing on their space or their culture or their women. I'm not sure what it is, right? Perhaps it stems from insecurity, but we have gotten messages from predominantly men or fake accounts usually, right? Like most of these people don't really say anything in their real accounts, but who are, yeah, who call it shameful or who say that this is ruining culture because we're talking about sex, something that they probably engage in anyways, right? Or that I should get a job, which I mean, this is a job. There's nothing wrong with doing it either, right? There's even a fake account at some point where they were like doctoring like text messages and being like, this is what she does for a living. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. This is what I do for a living. It's pretty well known that, you know, this is what I do. So yeah, I've gotten quite a bit of hate. Generally seems to come from the Tamil community, but I think that is purely because I am a Tamil woman. But I do think that the positivity outweighs the negative for sure.
What about those closer to, like, you talked about friends, what about family?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't even know if my dad still knows what I did. At some point, I remember when I first started, he was like, oh, this is like makeup because he knows I love makeup. And I'm like, no, not makeup. My mom knows what I do and she's really supportive of it. I think that, again, I'm privileged to be older, like I'm almost 30 years old. So there is that privilege of being an older woman who kind of gets to do what she wants. And I think she also understands that this is beyond just the act of sex, right? Like it's not a dirty word. It's not something that you should be ashamed of. And I think she also feels more comfortable that I'm much older and I'm not like the 16-year-old talking about it, right? So she's really supportive. My parents, for the most part, they're really good to go. My close family and friends are also really supportive. I will say, I think in terms of concern, I did have a few really close friends' parents mention that like they were worried, like what about my future or something like that. And in a genuinely concerned way, like they weren't saying it as like, you know, to talk crap or anything. But I just, you know, respond to them and say, but I'm almost 30 years old. Like I have a career. I understand where they're coming from, but that shouldn't be what my future career or whatever the case that they're concerned about is going to be based off of the fact that I own a sex toy store. So there has been some concern, but for the most part, everyone around me has been super supportive.
So yeah, you mentioned kind of your day job and we talked about it very briefly. So what do you do for your day job and like, how does that fit in the picture of like the evolution of Thaen Pot and Thaen X? Like, do you see yourself continuing to do that work side by side, or eventually do you want one to kind of take up more of your time than the other?
Yeah, so I am the head of digital at Niche Strategies. So I do a lot of digital marketing work for some startups that we currently have signed on to. But I also am an associate educator at BrainStation. So I teach their digital marketing diploma program, which I love doing. I love marketing and I love being able to share that in terms of teaching it back to people. How it really ties into Thaen Pot, Thaen X, I think as a digital marketer, these platforms live online. So for me, it almost comes natural to kind of have everything I do be focused in the digital space. In terms of will I be doing this for the rest of my life, like education, I would love to. I think that I really do love being able to teach people, right? Teach the future of digital, if you want to put it that way. So yeah, I'm enjoying what I'm doing right now in terms of the education side of things. I also enjoy being able to strategize with startups about their digital strategy and how they can grow online. That's always been something I'm passionate about. And I've been in that space for about 12 years now. But Thaen Pot and Thaen X are personal to me, right? I feel like that is kind of my part by giving back to the community. And so that's how I look at that.
Did you know that every time you left a 5 out of 5 review for this podcast, a Tamil parent lets their child pursue a career in the creative arts? Okay, that's probably not true, but if there's a chance that it is, do you really want to jinx it? Leave a review. Do it for the young creative in you. What would you say is how you want your legacy to be described by your friends and family, and how does Thaen X and Thaen Pot fit in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a deep question. If I were to, I don't know, I think my legacy is the person who has provided a safer space for people, right? Like, I don't believe there is such a thing as safe space because there's harm in everything, but I want to be known as a person who took action, right? Or did something that then led the way for other people to feel more comfortable. If we were to look at it in the most simplest way, I always credit an older generation for kind of breaking the norm of arranged marriages, right? Or dating outside of your culture. It definitely didn't come from the 90s babies. There were people in the 80s and 70s who were doing that. So I think of that generation's legacy as dismantling what purism looked like in culture. And so for my legacy, I hope that I'm able to do the same thing when it comes to things like sexual health and sexual wellness. Even if by a little margin, that's all I would ask for.
So if you had a chance to sit down with 16-year-old Mathusha face to face, what advice would you give her, or what would you tell her?
I would just tell her to relax. I feel like, being born in a Tamil family too, there's just always all these gears spinning. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to succeed? Especially as people who didn't go into traditional STEM, right? Like, I still ended up in it somehow, but it just was never my career path. And I've always considered myself to be more creative. So I would just tell myself to relax. It all works out in the end. And it's just about being consistent with what you believe in and what you like and sticking to it.
As an entrepreneur, and like I like to ask this to other entrepreneurs, what is your like relationship with money? Like, how do you like view it, or like how do you look at investing, just out of curiosity?
Yeah. So I will be completely transparent and say that I had such a piss poor relationship with money growing up, right? Like most families, I didn't grow up very wealthy. We grew up in Melbourne. My parents definitely provided everything, right? It's not like I struggled in that sense of things because they made sure that I never saw that side of things. But starting to work for the first time when you're like 16, 17 years old, it's like all of a sudden you have money, right? And so I think I had a really bad relationship with money up until my mid-20s. So like 5 years ago, where I would just spend everything I had, right? Or beyond what I had. And it was only after 25 where I got more serious and a little bit entrepreneurial in sense, right? Where I was like, hey, I want to do this and I want to do XYZ, but for XYZ, I need to have some sort of money because, people listening to this may also be a part of the startup world. They know that getting funding and capital is not the easiest walk in the park. So I have to have something to show for it. And how will I then manage everything if I can't manage myself? So I think once I hit 25, it was almost like a switch that went off where it was like, you need to like, one, pay off all your credit card debt because you have nothing to show for it. Like, where are all these Forever 21 clothes that you bought when you were 21, right? And the other one was just like building better habits and thinking more long-term in terms of how am I going to take care of myself? But I also, as a first and second generation Tamil person, how will I take care of my family, right? And I think that is a huge weight that's on a lot of people's minds. So yeah, in terms of right now that I'm 29, going on 30, I think my relationship with money is, it's not the greatest. I've slowly started investing in like Bitcoin. I think I started in 2018, which took a lot for me to like learn, right? I had to really talk to the people that I was around. So working in a startup, there was a lot of technical people and I'm like, hey, break this down for me because I don't understand it, right? And so now I put a little bit of money away each month just so that I can ensure that I'm able to do what I do. And that's the only reason like Thaen Pot and Thaen X are possible. So yeah, my relationship with money is a little bit more frugal, still not the greatest, right? I'm not going to say I save every single cent. I probably could be better, but I think I'm grateful that I started when I did.
You grew up in Melbourne. I didn't know that. Where in Melbourne did you grow up?
I grew up on Crow Trail. Shout out to Crow Trail.
Are you serious? I used to live at 97 Crow Trail.
Oh, you lived right on Crow Trail. I lived on
Yeah.
Crittenden Square.
Okay. Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
funny. I went to Tom Longboat, then I went to
Me
Mary
too.
Shad. I pretty much lived in Melbourne until I think I got married pretty much, then I moved. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I went to Tom Longboat, obviously the best elementary school in Melbourne. But then I went to Hilliard, and then I went straight to Pearson.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So Malverner for life, but it's a great place to grow up, right? I think there's some pretty awesome people who've come out of Malvern.
Yeah, because I know that when I went to university and I tell people I grew up in Melbourne or Scarborough, it's like always like, oh, but I
Yeah.
never like understood it. I was like, oh, Melbourne or like just Scarborough in general is amazing. And I think a few years ago I read like a New York Times piece about Scarborough being like the most ethnically diverse food spot in all of North America. And I was like, yeah, for sure. So,
Yeah.
and like obviously now because of housing prices, like there's more and more diversity, if you want to call it,
Yeah.
coming to Scarborough and like Melbourne. So just interesting that you.
Yeah. I mean, there's also, I still get that though, which is a bit like, it's kind of disappointing. Like sometimes I meet people who are from the West End, for example, and they're like, oh, where'd you grow up? And I'll say Malvern. They're like, oh, Malvern. Still don't get it though, right? Like I feel like when you're living it and you're growing up in these neighborhoods, it's just home.
Yeah,
So.
I guess that, and I didn't see as much of like the negative. That I feel like the negative was really kind of greatly overblown, but I also didn't see as much as other people that I know kind of saw it as well. For me, it was just kind of a lot of memories of kind of like where I got food or like just like I just remember in Melbourne and especially like where like my parents live now. It's just crazy like how Tamil it is. Like instead of like a grocery store every block, it's like a Tamil grocery store. Like I don't know, maybe there's a negative connotation to kind of all that ethnic diversity. I don't know. But
There
for
is.
me, I love it. Like I love going to Scarborough and just seeing all that.
Yeah, for us, it's community. And I think that's why a lot of the Tamil people, especially back then, congregated in the same areas, right?
Yeah.
The community. But there is definitely, it does boil down to the fact that it is predominantly Black and brown.
Yeah,
so
maybe that's why.
That could be a whole podcast on it.
Talking about that. What's like a recent like belief, behavior, or habit you've developed that's really positively impacted your life?
A belief or behavior. I think for me, it kind of ties back to what I mentioned about being 16 and just like chilling out, relaxing. I think a belief and behavior I learned now is how to relax, right? I think at some point, I know I work hard. And so I will always give myself that is the credit belongs to the fact that I work hard. And so also just believing in yourself, right? That probably goes to every single founder or creator where, they're good at what they do, but you're your worst critic. And so for me, I think the habit I've gotten into is just like trusting the process, trusting myself, and knowing that I will get it done or I will figure it out and not overthinking or spending long nights figuring out X, Y, and Z when it's already going to work out.
Got it. How do you consume new content? You seem like someone that's always trying to learn or like just consume information. So do you do that by books? Do you do it by like podcasts?
So interesting enough, I feel like there is definitely there's popularity with podcast and just like self-help-ish type books, but that's not my cup of tea. Like I'm not a big podcast listener.
Even though you created a podcast?
No, yeah. Like I'm just not religiously into like the, entrepreneurial.
Okay.
I like learning about people, right? So if it's like a biography or if it's like a podcast like this where you actually like learn about someone versus this is how you should do X, Y, and Z, or this is how you should invest your money. Like I just, for whatever reason, can't pay attention to those things, but I love to like, and maybe that's the storyteller in me, but I love learning about people's stories. And I find that far more fascinating. And to the point of podcast, I think there's lessons in that, right? That you take away from everyone's story, because although, we're all so different, there's so much commonality there.
Money can be hard to come by, but here's a $100 opportunity for you. Join my free newsletter for free exclusive content and a free chance to win $100 when I hold special draws. Did I mention that it's free? And who is somebody from the global Tamil community that you admire and why? And who's somebody that's non-Tamil that you admire and why?
So maybe like unpopular opinion. I
love it already.
I know, I am in the belief that I don't admire anyone.
Got it.
And I don't like to place that on anyone because I think it's unfair to place the whole I admire you or you're my role model title on people. I feel like if that was placed on me, it would make me really anxious and uncomfortable. And so for that reason, I also think, again, humans are like severely flawed, and that's just the way we are. And that's not a bad thing. It just means that I think when you look at people for inspiration or aspire to be like them, yes, there's certain bits and pieces of people like in general that I love, whether it's like your consistency with being able to create podcasts, right, and having so many things going for you, or another person's ability to run Fortune 500 companies. So there's like elements of people I admire, but I would not say I admire a single person.
I would say like, I mean, I don't answer it like that, but I do when I admire somebody, like you said, everyone has a flaw, like Elon Musk, amazing technologist and futurist, but probably horrible husband, friend, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's, like you said, there's bits and pieces of different people, even people that I don't necessarily like, would say I like. There's always something about somebody that you can admire. So I guess that's kind of why I like to ask.
No, I think that's fair. And I think for me also, just personally, I'm a founder, so obviously capital and making money is important to me, but then I also struggle with being a capitalist, right? So like, again, there's just all these internal battles about like, how do you be like ethically a capitalist? Is that even a thing? But at the same time, I also know that I need to be successful in order to, be comfortable in this world and also then be able to pay other people for their labor. And so how do you break that cycle of like terrible capitalism? So you kind of have to be a capitalist at the same time. So there's like just so many internal battles that I face when it comes to these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think as like as someone that's trying to be socially conscious but capitalistic, because I'm an entrepreneur as well, I think the way I look at money is it's kind of like a stored value of time. So it's like if I do well, like I guess it's like stewardship of money. Like, do I want someone like, Jeff Bezos having all the money and kind of distributing it the way he is, or like someone like that guy who I forgot the name of the company, but like he basically made everyone's salary like a livable wage, reducing his own. Like I'm like, that's like a really cool example of like, capitalism.
100%, I agree. Yeah, I think, and so I guess that's what you would define as, I guess, ethical capitalism. And I don't want anyone to attack me. Like, I'm not, I hate capitalism, but I definitely engage in it as someone who is making money, as someone who is a founder. But yeah, I think there is like positives and negatives, right? Like at the end of the day, you do need money. And as much as we can hate the idea of billionaires, like 10 billionaires in the world, in order to dismantle you, sometimes you got to be inside of it. So
yeah, and also like I think the capitalism we hear about is in the US, which is really like there you look at like income disparity, it's like ridiculous, like it's crazy. Versus Canada, I'm not saying it's that much better, but it's definitely better than the US. So I don't think there's any perfect models of capitalism. I think it's kind of depending on where you live, how you are, your situation. So yeah, to your point, there's no perfect solution.
Also, like children of immigrants, it's different for us, right? Like at the end of the day, I'm anti-capital, but I want my parents to be very comfortable, right? So there's that. But yeah, you're right. I think, but it's a good discussion, and I think people should be kind of talking about it. And there's always no negative to being conscious of how you impact other people. So
yeah, what's like a piece of advice? So like you created this amazing platform, you've kind of seen the benefits firsthand, and obviously you're making money, but it's kind of money in a good way where you're trying to build this platform up in a sustainable way. So you're a creator, so what's a piece of advice that you would give to someone listening to this that's an aspiring creator that like wants to take that first step, or they're afraid?
I think the first piece of advice I would give is just do it, like not to quote Nike or anything, but I've had conversations with young people, even older people who have, reached out saying they want to kind of discuss their ideas and whatnot. But I think that a lot of people do get just fixated on the idea, but not the next step. And so my piece of advice is literally just do it, regardless of whether or not you think that, oh, I'm going to wait till I make this much money, or I'm going to wait till I do X, Y, and Z, right? I think that every business can simply start with like an Instagram page, right? Or a Facebook page or a website. It doesn't have to be, I raised $100,000 and now I'm going to start my first step. So yes, talk about it. I'm not saying don't talk about it, but put it into motion. And that's the only way that you're going to then take the next step or the step after that. Or it might fail, which a lot of businesses do, and that's okay. But you're not going to know until you actually do it.
That's actually like a huge pet peeve of mine when somebody, again, it all depends on kind of your, like you said, your privilege, like where you are, etc. But like, I'm assuming somebody is in a certain place in life, and then when I hear excuses for not doing something when they could easily do it, like you said, you don't need $1,000 to create a website. You can just create an Instagram page, etc. Like all these simple things you can do. So I hate when people don't take action, but I know there's a lot of complexity behind that answer too.
Yeah, but I will say that the Tamil community, especially like the generations that we're seeing today, whether that's, the late millennials and the early Gen Z, is that they are quite entrepreneurial, right? Like, yeah. I think we're seeing so many more, and again, probably thanks to social media, but so many more entrepreneurs who are doing their own thing, which I think is incredible, right? Because they too took the first step. And I know that there is this like thing in the Tamil community, like how many of one thing do we need? And I'm like, well, as many as people want to create, like that's what creates competition, right? And that's supply and demand. So I think there is a first step there. And I also do think that there are now more resources than there ever were, in a sense that the people who have reached out to me didn't know me. They took a chance and it worked out for them. I'm more than happy to talk to people. I know that yourself and other people would also be happy to talk to people. So I will say that there are far more resources than there probably were for us in our early teens or something like that. So yes, privilege is huge here. But I do say that people should also go seeking these opportunities and looking for where they can kind of find an in.
Right. Well, it's a good segue into the final segment of the podcast, something that I kind of like to call Creator Confessions. Basically, I have like a bunch of statements. You're going to kind of give me first thought that kind of pops into your mind. Ready?
Okay.
Awesome. Favorite Tamil food?
Nandu curry.
Something that scares you?
Ghost or monsters, particularly in Tamil context.
What's an insecurity you have?
This shouldn't be hard, but it is. So that's good, I think. An insecurity that I have. I will say it's still like insecurity is still failing as much as I want it not to be.
Favorite show you're watching?
There was a show on Netflix called Al Rarabi, School for Girls. It's a Middle Eastern school show that's translated into English. I totally butchered it, but that show's really great.
A place you're itching to travel to after the pandemic is over / addressed, I guess.
I would love to go back to Morocco. There's a lot more I'd like to see.
So you've been there before?
I've been to Marrakesh.
Okay. Fellow Tamil creator you want to give a shout out to?
There's so many, like any creator. I want to give a shout out to Ashwini from Newell.
Okay. Your favorite childhood memory?
Gerard Street.
Gerard Street, like in terms of like walking around or just like?
Yeah, like when it was like the South Asian community just used to congregate there on weekends. Street corn, Tamil movie theater, like the OG Tamil movie theater. Yeah.
Damn gentrification. What do you do for fun outside of work?
Skateboarding.
Skateboarding. I didn't know that about you. Favorite film of all time?
I will get roasted if I say Harry Potter, so I'm not going to say that.
No, Harry Potter is a great film.
Yeah,
Nobody
it is. Okay, we'll stick to Harry Potter because it is.
It's not made for just children. What's a purchase you've made that you've splurged on recently in the last few years that you have zero regret about?
In the past few years, a splurge that I don't regret. Probably my tech, like my MacBook. It does everything for me. It's my world.
What's a pet peeve of yours?
Flopping. People who commit to something. Sorry, that's me in the first time. Yeah, just people who commit but like totally disappear. Pet peeve.
If you knew that you were going to die tomorrow, a regret that you would have?
If I was going to die tomorrow, regret I would have not taking my family or my parents traveling with me.
That's a good one. Age you want to retire by?
Tomorrow. I think 50.
Okay. Celebrity whose life you want to experience for just one day, even out of curiosity?
I'm going to say Elon Musk.
That guy, I think I've had like at least 20 people say his name, which is crazy.
Yeah, he's filthy rich, but he's also kind of like crazy but innovative. And yeah, I just would love to kind of see what goes on in his head.
I think one of the best answers I heard, other than Elon Musk, I mean, I've heard so many people say it, is somebody gave me an answer of somebody they didn't like particularly like, or someone that was kind of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just to kind of understand how their mind works. So I thought that was a cool answer. And finally, public service announcement you want to leave our audience with. So just kind of a final note on anything like your, what you're working on now or anything future coming up, or just any final thoughts you want to leave people with.
Yeah, some final thoughts would be to normalize conversations around sex and health. And that starts with your own personal life. So let's start there.
Okay, I thought you had some more. I thought you were just warming up, but that's a great way
I could, but I think that like encompasses it. I think if you start normalizing the conversation, imagine the world we could live in.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you again, Mathusha, for kind of jumping on and making time to connect and sharing your thoughts. I think like you said, I think sex is a very I don't know if it's misunderstood or just like not talked about in the right way. So hopefully what you're doing with Thaen Pot and Thaen X, as well as just kind of even this podcast, hopefully that kickstarts or helps that discussion along. If someone listening to this is like really inspired or they want to connect with you about Thaen Pot and Thaen X, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, so they can email me directly at mathusha@thaenpot.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn at Mathusha Senthil, and I will get back to you.
Awesome. Well, audience, thank you guys for tuning in as usual, and look forward to the next episode.
Thank you.